The question that we'll be exploring is, to what extent will the idolization of violent criminals affect society?
So this is an important question to ask because when criminals and their actions are sympathized with and idolized, their actions are more often excused and seen as more acceptable to society. And also when people such as Caroline Burnett, who was the wife of Ted Bundy, when people like that idolize and romanticize serial killers and shooters and stuff, they can find themselves more often in abusive relationships.
Another reason why this topic is important is movies, TV shows, and other videos that idolize violent criminals make up a significant part of our entertainment, and the things that we watch influence us and our opinions.
In regards to our question, it can't be answered simply by one lens or simply by one source. We would have to take into account multiple lenses or sources to come up with a concise conclusion, as well as the fact that there are a lot of different areas that need to be considered.
It's also recognized that there is people tend to have an appeal or a fascination with serial killers, but there's no answer as to why they put that appeal over the severity of their crimes.
So one article that we found that is within our gap that's talking about this topic is Shelley McMurdo's article, "It's a Filthy Goddamn Helpless World, Reimagining Columbine, Tate Langdon, and the Specter of School Shooters." This is a very relevant article to our topic because it both talks about the representation of historical events like shootings in media and how they're portrayed, and then also it goes more in depth on school shooter fandoms, which is a subsection of the social media website Tumblr, and is a platform in which people very commonly idolize and sympathize with these violent criminals.
And in an article titled Hybrosophilia from World Heritage Encyclopedia, which is peer-reviewed, psychologists and mental health experts explain why some people are affected by hybrosophilia, which is the attraction to criminals and murderers.
And in another article by Harold Schneider called Our Longtime Obsession with True Crime, he addresses the different crimes over time and how the different interests that people have had over them, but he still struggles to answer as to the reason for this interest and why there's a lack of sympathy that goes with it.
Heather Worthington, in a few different sources, studied how literature and fiction and nonfiction through society has sort of been fixated on violence and sort of romanticizing it, and the commodification of crime, as she puts it, how it affects society and the consumption of entertainment and such.
As well as within an article entitled Moral Nihilisms and Its Implications by Keflinger in 2017. He explores moral nihilism and essentially how it is an absence of moral values, and this can entail, this can affect not only the criminal but as well as the people who idolize the criminals, as they have a lack of right and wrong, or the understanding of right and wrong. And on this topic of philosophy, philosophy is the intellectual and logical study of fundamental issues, and the idolization of these violent criminals can very well be considered a fundamental issue. Through various forms of art, there have been depictions of violent acts in a way to entertain or intrigue the public. Take into consideration the novel Crime and Punishment, written by Dostoevsky, which looks into the nihilistic philosophy of a student that has murdered a woman. And this novel has been considered a masterpiece and is still well-renowned as of today, and depicts how connected art and philosophy are to the issue of making viewers sympathize with the criminal, and leaves us more vulnerable to begin to disregard their wrongdoings and turn a blind eye.
So it's also important to look into this topic under the historical lens, because many or most of the acts, like acts by serial killers and certain shootings, are very well regarded as historical historical events. And so it's important to look at these and like exactly what happened in them in order to see why people view them in the way that they do and why people often sympathize with the criminals. It's also important to look at the historical lens because certain motivations for their acts can be motivated by historical events. For example, Isla Koch was the wife of a commander of a concentration camp, and she was notorious for abusing and especially maiming the prisoners in the concentration camp. And so her sadism was motivated by the Holocaust, which was like a historical event of the time. So although it's not okay to excuse her actions, it is possible to look into why these were committed and why other people might end up sympathizing with them.
People throughout history have always been interested in horror genres of sorts, and it ties a lot with the society of the time and the culture around it, like Frankenstein and Dracula by Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker respectively during the Victorian times were both about human-like monsters terrorizing the people. And this sort of raises the question, like, how does this translate to modern time, and how it does, to what extent does this tie in with the current events of the time and the literature surrounding it?
Another significant lens to consider while researching this gap is the psychological lens. And this lens is important because it examines how serial killers are mentally ill, and this partially explains their actions. It also considers psychological reasoning behind why people are interested in violent crimes and why some are even attracted to the people who commit these crimes. It also identifies psychological differences and thinking patterns in violent criminals and people who are interested in or attracted to them. And then we can use this to determine who these types of people are and how much of an impact they have on society.
Another lens we can look through to help research this is the ethical lens, because there's a universal obsession with serial killers, even though it may not be respectful or appropriate towards the victims. So with this lens, we can look deeper into why or what makes this topic so appealing to people, and what makes the morality disregarded. For example, in the movie My Friend Dahmer was about, or it told the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, and they created profit out of his story, even though it affected the victims' families. So with society's obsession, it diminishes the nature of the crimes and the effects it has on the victims. And so looking through this lens, we can understand why morality is disregarded and the effect it has on the public.
And these are our references.